You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast.
In the world that we live in, and especially when we talk about Africa, we have had a very long history of politics without hygiene. So my work has been ideally to come back into the field of bringing a bit of sense into what the new Africa looks like. If you were to look at things like M-Pesa, as much as it is technology, it has created a digital economy where people who are now not only unbanked, but they're now transferring money amongst each other. Africa in itself is standing right at the precipice of success. Ethical leadership must be at the center of what is the new age of Africa.
Stay tuned as we bring you inspiring people who are unlocking Africa's economic potential. You're listening to the Unlocking Africa podcast with your host, 𝐃𝐨𝐧'𝐭 Adamu.
Welcome to the Unlocking Africa podcast, where we find amazing people who are doing amazing things to unlock Africa's economic potential. Today, we have Professor Edgars, who is a multi-award winner, business authority, seasoned diplomat, and cutting-edge thinker and author. Welcome to the podcast, Professor Edgars. How are you?
I'm doing quite great. Thank you for having me.
I'm not sure if you've listened to the podcast before, but I usually like to start from the beginning. So I was hoping you could introduce yourself and tell us a bit more about Professor Edgars.
Wow, that's quite a question to go with, Adamu. And quite oftenly when people ask me that question, I try to simplify to three things that people can understand and that they can remember. The first thing is I'm a lover of music. So
Brilliant.
Talk about King Duke, or talk about Rachel Ferrell in jazz, and you have my undivided attention. Above all things, of course, I'm a father. It's always good to see how your children now as adults are trying to imitate and place the world in your eyes. And so you can clearly see whatever it is that you're saying in motion. And that's the most important part. And last but not least is I'm always African all the time. So that's as simple as it becomes, because in a world where populism has taken center stage, people forget that our culture and our tradition is foremost very important. So I am African all the time.
Amazing. You've given us a great insight into who you are. You're a music lover, father, and African, just like myself. Yeah. We're both music lovers, fathers, and African. So I guess that's a great start to the conversation. One aspect of yourself is that your personal and business sphere of influence includes presidents and heads of states. You've just let me know that you're on your way to Kenya tomorrow to visit the new president, which is amazing. Looking forward to hearing all about that event and what happened. So that's a great piece of insight. You're connected to presidents and heads of states across several continents who you give strategic advisory service to. So I was wondering, how did this come about and what type of work does it involve?
First off is understanding that in the world that we live in, and especially when we talk about Africa, we have had a very long history of politics without hygiene, and that has brought us to the nadir of civilization. So if you were to look at Africa in its entirety today, it's a continent where people have relegated Africa to be merely an appellation describing the geographical space called Africa. And so I took it upon myself to always have an interest in the notion of world leadership, but more so concern myself with African leadership. And it seems to me that it has become rather archaic. It is redolent of James Bond movies and Kipling ballads.
Yes.
Part of my work has been to considerably move the imprint of more research, of more knowledge into the offices that they hold, and to question whether or not their work is actually working. Is it that Africa is just another continent? Are we disparaging our neighbors? Are we adulating ourselves in terms of endearment while simultaneously disparaging our neighbors? Does Africa need her own idiom, identity, and destiny, equidistant from Judeo-European and Arabic Islamic world? And so, edifying as that may sound, my work involves the real getting down to the dirty and far away from just the science. Is talking about intergovernmental organizations, talking about leadership in itself, talking about the devolution of government and the structure of law and its technicalities. So I'm ultimately right in the middle of the details down to the decimal.
Fantastic. So you touched on Africa's long history and politics, which is sometimes quite opaque. It's not very transparent. And the need for it to cleanse itself and implement some type of hygiene, and your interest as well in world politics and Africa. I guess within that work, you have an outstanding record when it comes to things such as planning, management, and executing highly successful private and public sector initiatives in Africa. So I was hoping you could talk us through some of those initiatives that you've been involved in.
Thanks for asking that. I think one of the things of what has happened in Africa is we've killed the age of political innocence. And what that has done, it has lended a credence to the statement that universal suffrage without universal education is a curse. So my work has been ideally to come back into the field of bringing some sense and bringing a bit of sense into what the new Africa looks like and tidying up a bit of the history. Although it might be a bit invidious to many, but for me, I've seen a rectitude of good men and good women in Africa who have formed the new step up of what the new Africa is like and what are the new conversations. So when we are talking about public health in Africa, what does that look like? When we are talking about education, transformation, we're talking about the 4IR, the fourth industrial revolution. When we're talking about social development and social education, and how do all these things come together, and then how do we devolve these things in terms of government from the functions that we know as exclusive functions or concurrent functions or residual functions. So our work has been over time to be able to lend to initiatives that have got a sense of social development, a sense of education and academia and knowledge production and insight and the intersectionalities of what the impact it has towards the economy. So quite a variety of them. If you were to look at things like M-Pesa, as much as it is technology, it has created a new economy, a digital economy, where there are tons and tons of people who are now not only the unbanked in countries, but they're now transferring money amongst each other. And once we can get a circulation of that, we create a new economy. Be that as it may, it might be actually very interesting for you to note, like right now in South Africa, we've got 60% of people who are actually for informal banking, 40% are not. But that 40% who are not in the formal banking are worth 40 billion rand. Can you imagine? That is money that is not going through the economy.
Yes.
So to bring that back and say the tyranny of success is a well-known dynamic, that what led to today's successes will ultimately lead to tomorrow's failure, and bringing those conversations back to what can we do about it and what are we doing to clean up those airways about it.
So you touched on a key point there, which involves that your work is about defining the new Africa. So from your experience or from your perspective, what does the new Africa look like?
I'd want to, and permit me to say this, there's a very huge, and I know that at this specific point, I'm currently giving a lot of fodder to analysts around the world. But the notion of Africa becoming a world leader is important. And perhaps let's focus on that for a second.
Yes.
Is it because of the population? We are on course to top the charts. We will overtake the globe by 2035. That is given. Is it the economy? We're on the course to be the largest economy in the world by purchasing power in parity terms. So to retain the aesthetics of our arguments as to what the new Africa is like, we're talking about soft power. Thoughtful historians have been able to put this down, but I think that Africa's story of successes is near to be told and told whole. There has been quite a list, and unlike Western democracies, our laws specifically impose reasonable restrictions in the interest of various things. But Africa's story is not told whole. And I think if we were to pay attention to what it is and be detailed to the decimal, we would see an Africa that cannot be competed by any bar.
Interesting. I agree 100%. So you did touch on in terms of the soft power that is required to push Africa forward. And I know in previous conversations, you've also talked about how Africans should embrace emerging ways to cultivate a greater sense of purpose and direction in our policy, both domestic and foreign. I was wondering if you could shed some more light or go into more detail regarding that.
So Africa has excluded a lot of people from the epicenter of the economy. And what do I mean by that? The youth, the disadvantaged in terms of historical disadvantage. And one of the reasons is because there's no place for them in legislative confabulations. So we are reaping the adulation of a good life well spent after all what laurels are to rest on, but that is much more of whatever other economies are showing on our part. But my argument is preceded by three epigraphs. The first is that if we are to look at Africa, then we must ask within a sense of purpose that what have we been able to adapt to? In the greater scheme of things, the proposition that Africa is not, as people keep calling it, an underdeveloped continent, but rather in the context of its history, a highly developed one in an advanced stage of decay. The other part is the interpolation. There have been regional economic communities from time immemorial, and nothing is going to change that. But what has been missing, and in terms of how do we then reposition Africa, it has marked the beginning of a reputation of triumph without violence. We have constantly been known, and if you are to look at the news for the last millennium, you will realize that Africa has always been thrown in the middle of wars, if nothing else. But now we are taking a center stage in terms of economies. We're taking high office from the UK to the US. We do have a lot of Africans that are taking that particular part of government and leadership. And so we must tie the history as it should be. The other part is the reinterpretation of what then would be the parallel conventions to our laws. And that's a very heavy topic to go into. But I'd definitely say Africa has been replaced from what was known as men and women with palaces and principalities and 21-gun salutes. And it has clearly descended to a matter of importance where we are not only focused on that, but we are saying, can we transcend any considerations of olfactory inconvenience? Can we transcend the idea of knowledge and its potential power? And that is the new Africa that we must focus on.
Brilliant. So you touched upon there in terms of the youth have not been included in a lot of policy and governance. I know you've spoken quite widely in terms of the important area of governance is to ensure that ethical leadership is at the forefront of our business and societal operations. So from your perspective, what is the importance of effective or ethical leadership in an African context?
I will point towards simultaneously, and I recall this just the other day, I was rereading Martin Luther King Jr.'s collection of sermons called Strength to Love. And of course, Louis Fisher's book, The Life of Mahatma Gandhi, Mahabharata, the Muslim's character by Al-Ghazali. And in the pages of those books, not to mention the Bible, Quran, and Gita, I found what, in my view, is the antidote to our malady today: genuine love, justice, truth, and selflessness. Ethical leadership must be at the center of what is the new age of Africa. And why that is important is because we have been proven doomsday by Afro-pessimistic prophets wrong when we embark on the conversation about Africa. We cannot afford the luxury of living in countries where virtue is a vice and vice is a virtue. So the gene of corruption, the gene of all misinterpretations towards good governance performing their Makaba dance is nearly done, because we are now right in the center where we are saying politics, governance, leadership without hygiene must be done away with. And an obvious anodyne meant to soothe our pain can only be us not losing sight of the antelope and focusing on the squirrel. We must get to a point where Africa said, this is the direction we are taking. More often than not, if you do agree with me, a lot of our leaders are absolute lambs in person. You wouldn't be able to tell. But the anonymity of the internet that emboldens them to spew the most vile things and accredit themselves to perform in ghost avarices, be it in political parties, is ruining the economy. And that is why right now we have a cargo cult mentality. The belief that one day, without any effort on their part, a ferry ship laden with goods will dock off at the port of hope in Africa and we will live happily ever after. There's got to be effectiveness in ethical leadership that says, this is the way we are going. This is what is required. We must pierce the corporate veil, that people must be held accountable. There must be audit. There must be questions that are asked when we talk of the new age leadership.
So do you believe that ethical leadership is widely practiced and understood in Africa?
To answer that in a much different way,
okay,
this is almost like the American saying to the widow of the American president, apart from that, Mrs. Lincoln, how did you enjoy the play? We constantly miss the bus because we are thrown under its will. In Africa, we must remember that ethical leadership has not been practiced widely. And why is that? Because nothing limits achievement like small thinking.
Yes.
And nothing expands possibilities like unleashed thinking. There has been a good number of people that have had the idea that Africa must stick is an appellation describing just the geographical space. And so they have made certain that we only think within that space. We have not been able to transcend the idea of what will Africa be, and then hence, what do we need to do? So if you were to listen to the vox pops that inundate African airwaves, we are suffering from wild ignominy. Most of them, if anything, are not thinking of what is legacy leadership? What are we going to do after we come from this particular point of leadership? And so there's quite a huge vacuum. I mean, the average age of leadership in Africa is 70, right? Or 60, yes. Put it at 60. The average young person in Africa is 20. We have got a 40-year-old vacuum in between. What's happening there? And we must be able to discuss that as to what will be the success of tomorrow with that 40% vacuum that is happening.
Very interesting point there. So from your perspective, who would be an example of an ethical African leader, past or present?
An ideal stand to take, and I'm of the objective view, that ethical leadership is not entirely based on the person, it's entirely based on the impact, and it's entirely based on the result.
Yes.
We often have likened to who would be the best example of a person who we would look at. But that would be difficult because let's at least introduce a little bit of some irreducible minimums, right? In every human being, there must be at least an ounce of failure that we must be able to look at. So the Puritinal approach would be then to say, who are the leaders who have failed in their quest to change the course of Africa? Mwalimu Julius Nyerere, and if you were to look at them, most of them did not succeed in tidying up the history of Africa, but at least they implemented the very essence of what would be the guiding principle of the new Africa. Mwalimu Julius Nyerere was one, Patrice Lumumba, another, Kwame Nkrumah, another, Nelson Mandela, another, and I could name them. But my biggest issue with that is that those who are the forefathers of Pan-Africanism, who are the new age leaders that are speaking in the very essence of where Africa is and where Africa needs to go. And that is failing us because we are not producing knowledge.
And you've touched on an important point there in terms of not producing knowledge, because I know as an African scholar, you're a huge champion of how we can embrace knowledge production and intensify our efforts towards producing more knowledge on African local research. So what is the importance of that in terms of increasing knowledge of African local research?
So we present a picture, and I believe that this is something that Africa is well on its way to currently correct. We present a picture of a united front as Africa. However, we know that the same borders that identify each country are the same borders that separate us, right? So if you were to look at Africa in terms of knowledge production, we stand at 2.3% of the global production in terms of knowledge and research. So intellectually, we have the tallest academic dwarf in Africa. Why do I say that? And I mean no disrespect to my colleagues and all of the others who have taken time in studying, but knowledge is potential power. Execution beats knowledge. So we must not confuse knowledge and mastery. If we are to tell all the stories of Africa and produce the knowledge of it, the issues of dynastic succession is, as every television viewer knows today, a powerful aphrodisiac. We would be able to then gauge where we stand today and say, this is where the Africa we come from was. Wherever we are going to is not in excesses of phrases. It is all very well, but at this stage, we must let some things go and unleash a new choice of epithets that we can store up for purpose. What is a new Africa need, and what are the priorities that we have to go and embark on? We cannot confuse the issue and the act of government and parliament. That is a totally and entirely different conversation. But Africa in itself is standing right at the precipice of success, but it continuously keeps going back, where all of us in Africa agree that the places we were born was a great edifice in those days. We have lost all that glory. Why? Because people have brought in their own parallel confabulations and they're treating Africa as their own background.
So you've touched on some key points there in terms of the importance of knowledge and its importance in understanding our past and future innovations. So if we look at innovations, why is innovation and entrepreneurship important in Africa? And from your experience and the work that you do, what role do you think it plays in the construct of the Africa that we want?
That's a very good question to go on, because if we are to look at business in itself, and big business, small business in Africa, business calls for the exercise of the mind and skill. It develops skill of hand, promptness of judgment, keenness of insight, and perseverance in effort. Of all those things, there are very key values that are needed for the governments of today. And I constantly say that leaders in government are like CEOs in organizations. And so they must run them with a keenness that it deserves. So integrating business in the center of economy is important. Why? Because business is the one that will resolve the issue of unemployment. We hire people. If business is not part of economy, then economy doesn't exist. So in terms of business being the center and not in the periphery of the economy, it also, business speaks to matters of leadership and governance. Business speaks to matters of legalities, which at times in government I've said that many a time leaders have learned the art of running around circles in terms of law. But in business, there's a greater call, because you're practically reined in writing in terms of what you can practice and what you cannot practice. So business doesn't just solve the idea of unemployment, it solves the issue of ethical leadership. It solves the issue of what becomes the priorities, because in business we move in on key strategic objectives for the year, while in government you and I both realize that in the first 100 days, as much as it's publicized what the leaders are going to do, they never get to achieve those things even in 200 days. So I do think that business being a center drives then one of the interventions in terms of what are the levers to achieving some of the things that government wants to do. In the other part, leadership, business also attracts a certain essence of leadership. Why? If you were to keenly look at countries where half of the leaders came from a business front, you start to get the sense that perhaps you would close your eyes and sense the fact that some of those leaders indeed are bringing some of their business values into government, and they're integrating what they believe into every single area of their life. So I do believe that business speaks to so many things. It speaks to the idea of the youth, because the imperative is to them needing skills. It brings in the new sense of thinking. How do we expand our possibilities? It brings a sense of developing skills, critical skills that are needed for government. It brings the idea of promptness of judgment. How do we move Africa forward? The keenness of insight, because you and I both understand that part of being in a board is making sure that we have horizon scanning. Government doesn't have horizon scanning. Government deals on a more reactionary purpose. If something happens today, like COVID, you and I would wonder, why were we not prepared?
Yes.
Okay. In terms of perseverance in effort, it is not only entirely about the benefits and the perks that come with it. People in business are there at the end of the day to solve social issues, a human need. And if that can be incorporated in government thinking, then by far, I tell you that the business should be the imitator towards government and leadership.
Thank you for that, Professor. You mentioned something quite important, which is the importance of integrating business in the center of economy. So, in Africa, most businesses are run by entrepreneurs, but an area of entrepreneurship that we rarely discuss in Africa is social entrepreneurship.
Right.
From your perspective, what does that look like in Africa, social entrepreneurship?
So on my long list of things to do before I die is to successfully be able to solve a human need that doesn't just perceive of the country I'm in or from the people of choice, but it must speak to the idea of the continent at large. And so we are lost to idea of preoccupation with instant solutions when we talk about social entrepreneurship.
Yes.
We have a lot of blind faith that if we put in enough effort and money, anything is possible, and an unwillingness and an inability to see the long-range consequences of some of the quick fixes which we are trying. So most people have then said social entrepreneurship must be speaking to what we know as corporate social responsibility, corporate social investment, which now I say it's a lot of confusion, because the narrative as to what is social entrepreneurship must be dictated by certain terms and constructs that are only prevalent in that society. The issues that we have in South Africa are not similar to the issues they have in Sierra Leone, are not similar to the issues they have in Nigeria, and not similar to the issues they have in Egypt. Though we come from one continent, it does not mean by and by that we do have the same concern. And so if we are to articulate a testimony to originality or merit of such, then it must be that social entrepreneurship must be defined by the constructs of the local community and the social imperatives of whatever is happening within that society. It cannot be a blanket question. And so when we say that a specific example, let us solve the issue of female economic empowerment. Can we understand that economic empowerment in South Africa is not the same as economic empowerment in West Africa, and neither will it be the same economic empowerment in East Africa, though it sounds the same. And if we were to use the terminologies in law, context is important. If context is important, then what are the issues that prevail in West Africa? What are the issues that prevail in East Africa and South Africa? We must stop the idea of the wisdom of crowds, the herd mentality that Africa's problems are by any chance the same. The townships we have in South Africa are not similar to the provinces they have in Lagos, are not similar to the counties they have in Kenya. All of this have got very dynamic issues. And if we are to talk about devolution of services, devolution of government, devolution of thinking, then we must speak to the construct and the context at all times.
Brilliant. A key point that you raised is that we are always looking for quick fixes, and also the narrative of social entrepreneurship must be determined by the local society. So if we're looking at society and the impact that social entrepreneurship can have, what economic, social, or cultural contribution do you feel social entrepreneurship can have in African economies?
I'd want to take that one at a go. And when we speak about what economic, social, or cultural contributions, we must then speak to the identity that we serve in Africa.
Yes.
We're talking about, we have quite a mosaic of languages in Africa. And if we are to speak to those languages, then we must say that social entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurs and innovation on African economies is part art, part craft, part science. Why? Because we must not only borrow the fact that the assurance of new thinking may say nothing of the practical worth of the content. We have to be able to speak towards those languages. This is a commonality, and I have to speak towards what has happened in the United Nations, what has happened in the regional economies. We ignore the very languages that we stand for. And so now there's a huge conscience that is arising that is saying our languages matter. We must speak to the tradition of Africa. What is it that we practice, and what is it that we do that affects the very idea of analysis and logic, imagination, instinct, attitude, skill, and luck? Because those things are prevalent in innovation today. The reason M-Pesa has succeeded in Africa by far is because when you look at the evolution of banking, it speaks towards table banking, it speaks towards digital currencies, it speaks towards digital economies. However, you have to remember that in those communities that people live in, there has not been anything formal in terms of banking except the banking that we know. You and I know, the checking, the savings, and all of that.
Yes.
These people have got certain fears of banking. So what M-Pesa did is they then categorically thought, let us re-educate the economy. Let us re-educate the populace into what new age banking would look like, but on your phone. How much more trust can you have than that which you hold in your hand? So it drove bigger numbers than what the banks are reporting if you were to look at their income. We must integrate those social constructs into our idea of innovation today. When we're speaking about things to do with the youth, we must remember that the youth of today in Africa, driven by however much what Western civilization might look like, what Asian dominance might look like, are still in the construct of an African predominant thinking. We must remember that as we drive innovation, there is patriarchal issues, there is institutional issues that have existed in Africa. And so we must incorporate that. Otherwise, we have too many good ideas that are dying quick. Why? Because we do not factor in these thoughts. And so the prescriptions that many are quick to follow when they hear about innovation is Africa. If you were to look at Thomas Peters' 1982, and he spoke about the 8 things in search of excellence, or James Collins' 1994, when he spoke about the 9 things from built to last, or Michael Tracy in 1995, when he spoke about the 3 things from the discipline of market leaders, Jim Collins, 2001, the 7 things from good to great, Jim Collins, 2011, the 6 from great by choice, Michael Consumo, 2010, the 5 from staying power, William Joyce, 2003, the 4+2 of what really works, Vanguard Management, the 7 things, the 9 from the agenda, the 4 principles of enduring success advocated by Christian Stadler in a Harvard Business Review article, the 3 rules for making a company truly great by Michael Rayner in the Harvard Business Review article. We are quick to always postulate whatever it is that has been said in other articles. But you and I can right now argue, what are we saying about our African authors?
Very true.
What is it that we are referring to from the greats of Professor Callistus Juba, who's in Harvard, Professor Ngugi Thiong'o, Professor Stella Nkomo? We are not referring to knowledge in Africa. And that is why, for as long as we will continue to imitate rather than develop, we are left with a huge idea as to the tyranny of numbers. We are left to be both the judge and the jury until such a time that we must be able to transcend the thought of the wisdom of crowds and get to a point and say, Africa is not driven by what is happening in the West. We are driven by the things that are important to us, and this is what they are.
Amazing, amazing, amazing. So you've given great insights into the innovation and contribution of social entrepreneurs and the contribution of African knowledge. So one thing you touched on in terms of we don't support our own African knowledge, academics, social entrepreneurs. So as Africans, how do we go about changing that? What can we do better to support African social entrepreneurs, academics, just African knowledge in general?
I would want to understand, and more so when I speak about social entrepreneurs and I speak about their development today, we must look at what we are experiencing from the channel conflict of where social entrepreneurship begins and why it has died. People have largely forgotten that Africans are very good at forgiving and forgetting. So they have forgotten as well, which I object to. Let them forgive, but let them not forget that we come from a past of offshoring of our ideas, offshoring of our operations. Much has been taken from Africa and has been put in other economies. So we need to reshore back what has happened, bringing operations back to our home country. Why? Because we need to speak to this thing, the increasingly desperate search for silver bullets. Everybody wants to know what's going to work tomorrow, but very few are involved with the actual science of what is not working. There's a lot of disappointing performance. There's a poor problem diagnosis. There's inappropriate interventions, wrong tools, wrong systems. There's initiative overload. And a lot of complexity. If you are to look at things happening in Ghana today and look at things happening in Sierra Leone, look at things happening in Botswana, in Eswatini, there's too many things that are initiative overload. And I'll speak towards that when we come to the Africa Free Trade. There's a lot of fake support. cynicism, if you'd have it, or distrust. There's confusion, lack of focus. There's silo behavior. We compete against each other. So if Adamu comes to me and says, hey, I have a podcast tomorrow morning, guess what? I have a podcast too. But if we were to collaborate and say, what is this that we have? What is our understanding of how to compete and how to win? And how can we evolve that with a predictable surprise that will arise in the future? That is not where we are at. And so it is very easy then to know this is where we are not going to support. So governments don't know where to support when they look at how do we then respond to growth leadership? How do we respond to fast learning and adaptation? How do we have the ability to sense and make sense of change and to act on it and learn from it faster than our history? Where do we put our focus, our value, our costs? What is the business model innovation that is currently happening? And how do we create value? How do we deliver value? How do we capture value and share that value? At what point do we have the resource and capability acquisition? At what point do we have the development stage and leverage that? At what point do we persuade individuals and organizations with an interest to vote for it rather than against it? At what point do we know how to do the right things in the right order and at the right time? And more than most, at what point do we employ a deliberate and systematic way to turn intentions into actions and results? If we can have all that within our practices of essence, both in leadership, in government, and in business, then social entrepreneurship will thrive.
Thank you for that, Professor. You touched on something important, which is how as Africans we have always offshored our operations, and now it's time to bring back operations to our own society. I don't think we can have that conversation without mentioning the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So from your perspective, what is the opportunity of the African Free Trade Continental Agreement?
Adamu, allow me to have rather a moment in having a good laugh when I can.
Why is that?
As much as we grease the wheel with the conversation of the Africa free trade, one of the things that we must remember, let us look at China if we can. Everything that happens in China is a top-down repressive system. It is like a limousine of states that goes on a cruise control on a 6-lane expressway. What happens if it suddenly hits an unexpected pothole?
Yes.
We are not certain. And as I say this, I'm very careful that we like to place valuations on things and we place them at a very high multiple in Africa. We talk about the Africa free trade opportunity. Is there really an opportunity? Let us start there. The role of regional economic communities in Africa's integration has happened before. This is nothing new, right? If anybody would be keen to analyze the role of regional economic communities in Africa, then notice that the Africa free trade in itself, nothing new is happening here. The legal text of the Africa free trade about how this is going to happen and what the RECs must actually do is very new to the incremental proceeds of the discourse of how do we structure, where should it take place, what should be on the agenda, and how it recognizes the RECs as legal persons in their own right and have their own legal instruments with obligations from their member states. But that in itself is the issue that we are having today. How do we create integration agendas when things have been treaty upon treaty upon treaty? We are only amending them. Each of these member states has a unique history, a unique profile, and a unique value. Do we borrow this within the Africa Free Trade? The RECs are not party to the Africa Free Trade Agreement. If you were to note that, member states of the RECs are also Africa Free Trade State parties. So to enforce that and to bring economic integration in Africa is a member-driven process. So that individuality is important. What does that then mean? The opportunity only exists if we can qualify what is the role and specific principles of each member towards the free trade. Not the origins of home, and we're not going to go into that, not the building blocks for the Africa Treaty, not the variable geometry. not the preservation of the acquis, not the reciprocity, not the consensus in decision-making and the best practices. This has been done before. Whatever binds the African Union, binds the state parties, binds the RECs, and more than anything, what bound the Organization of African Unity is nothing new to us. What we must then question is we must carefully weigh interests and benefits of each member state and what it's going to bring to the table. Because only then can we hold them accountable and say, what is the opportunity today? But if I were to ask you today, you have not yet had an opportunity to see anything further than this is who is responsible for the effective implementation and enforcement of the Africa Free Trade Agreement.
You've raised some very interesting points there. You mentioned how, obviously, free trade in Africa is not new. We've had directs for decades, many years, and the implementation and integration is member-driven. So, yeah, as you touched on there, the success of AfCFTA depends on the collaboration of multiple stakeholders to reduce things such as red tape and to simplify customs procedures. So on a personal level, what is our contribution as Africans? What needs to be done and what potential outcome do you think is realistic?
Adamu, it has always been known, and perhaps I will use our African anecdotes because that is where I come from.
Yes.
The car can never outrun the ground. We must form a neat architecture, if anything, as to what is the long-standing feature of our regional integration landscape. The members of the RECs that are not yet FTAs, and by that I mean free trade areas, and belong to REC configuration, how are we going to understand and how are we going to make an important idea that their views do not overlap REC membership? How are we not going to duplicate trade governance measures? How are we going to make compliance with standards and the pursuit of regional value chains more easier? And we also have to deal with trade costs. As much as we like the ambiguity of the English in it, and like I said before, we are tied in high multiples. We could speak to tons and tons of things. And I'm often drawn into this, that if we were to look at an analysis of 3,000 of the world's largest companies to understand which achieved outsized profitability over time, which ones underperformed and what accounted for the difference, the metric used in the analysis would be economic profit or economic value added, which is the profit of a company generates after paying back its investors the use of their capital. Let us speak to the same when we talk about looking at Africa today. Allow me, if you will.
Yes.
We have 400 companies in Africa that earn revenues of $1 billion or more per annum. We have nearly 700 companies with revenue greater than 500 million USD. Africa has 700 largest companies earning a combined $1.4 trillion in revenues. The total revenue pool of large companies in Africa, excluding South Africa, is a third of what it could be. SMEs are responsible for 77% of all jobs in Africa and as much as half of GDP in some countries. Now, as much as there's growing demand and shortage of supply, more discretionary income by few retail stores per capita, in Africa, there are 60,000 people per formal retail outlet compared with just about 400 people per store in the USA. Africa is underpenetrated in retail options. Online sales currently stand at 0.5% of total retail stores in Africa compared with 4% in India, 10% in the United States, and 17% in China. What does that mean? Africa is underperforming on so many fronts. We must qualify the idea of how do we then integrate ourselves into real economic terms when it comes to Africa's participation. What are we doing in terms of trade, and how do we shift the idea of what are we bringing to the table? We could speak for, we could go on days, and I prove to you as it is.
I'm sure we could.
We could sit here and demystify valuations on investment. We could speak to the entire value chain of what is here for production. But be that as it may, it only stands to one thing. Africa will only move on the goodwill of participants. If you and I agree that we can get this done, we can get it done. For as long as people treat the idea of movement in Africa to be something that requires an act of parliament, we are constantly going to keep getting stuck. We are way past the Rubicon and we are burning our boots. We must get to a point where when we speak about Africa, let us speak in its real terms, not the superficial. Intrinsically, extrinsically, can we then start to speak about what we are going to do? What is the transformative problems we need to speak about? What is the radical intelligence we need to cultivate and leverage? Not the artificial. What is the scalable relevance? What is the knowledge democratization? What is the collaborative ecosystems that we need to speak about?
I agree 100%. I think it's quite clear that you're extremely cautious or pragmatic about the contribution that AfCFTA can make towards the wider African economy. So if we focus on, say, social entrepreneurship and social development, what contribution can AfCFTA make in those areas?
I hold the objective view that much of what has been told about the participation of the Africa Free Trade in the general objectives, which are in Article 3, to resolve the challenges of multiple and overlapping members and expedite the regional and continental integration process. It is important to open those borders. It is important that we can only solve our problems for Africa, by Africa, and that should be the agenda of talks about the future of the Africa Free Trade. Many would want to circumvent this conversation you and I are having, Adam, when they would speak in numbers. And like I said before, people want to talk about an aggressive return target of inflation plus 7%. You would tend to need between 35% to 40% offshore. A return target of inflation plus 6% is more in line with a typical balanced trend with around 30% offshore. We cannot dictate numbers when we come to Africa, especially if the focus is wrong. For us to know where we are going to, it is important to know where we come from and where we are. And that divide is not easy for us to talk about for as long as Africa has not yet sat down to qualify the statement of what is social entrepreneurship today. We all have different things. We have accepted responsibility for sensitive political matters such as regional stability. We have demonstrated that Africa needs assistance in efforts to restore its own pro-democracy. We have insisted that protocol systems will promote peace and security within our areas, so stability is important. We have insisted on a common foreign policy. We have insisted on cooperating and breaking down of law and order. But that we are not a homogeneous set of regional integration arrangements. We pursue similar but often also dissimilar objectives. And I'd point you then to, if you are a Puritan of literature, where it is said in a marriage of convenience, though you sleep in the same bed, you are of different thoughts. We must have a united Africa with its historical importance, enjoying recognition of third parties as entities which can collaborate and conclude on reciprocal trade agreements. We must promote the objective of African free trade, but the formula for doing so must still be worked on. I believe there is a chance for social entrepreneurship in it.
Amazing, amazing. So it's clear that AfCFTA is a policy for the future, one that I think us as Africans are keenly keeping an eye on. And as you mentioned, the focus must be accurate so we know where we are going in the future. So if we keep to the theme of the future, I know you're a huge advocate of social entrepreneurship and social development. Where do you see social entrepreneurship and social development in Africa in 5 years' time?
The fact that you and I, Adam, were having this conversation means that in 5 years' time, we should be able to have a different conversation.
Brilliant. I like that.
As Tom Lehrer said in the famous lyric, the Lord's our shepherd, says the song, but just in case, we better have a bomb. We are in the buying perpetuity. We have the regime insurance, if you like, that if we are to push the agenda of a united Africa, the central argument being the story of Africa must be told and told whole. And maybe the actors in this case might not be as irrational as they may seem, but that being the center and the focus of it, then you and I in 5 years will be speaking about the conversion of not just where the position of social entrepreneurship is, but the good it has done, the impact it has created, the results, the interventions that it has spoken to, and why social entrepreneurship has become the lever towards the social maladies that we have in Africa. We can solve these issues, but we must start discussing where did we go wrong? Why did we go wrong? And how do we solve these concerns by ourselves? They cannot be solved by the people who are not here.
That's an extremely profound, knowledgeable, and insightful vision of Africa in the next 5 years. So if we look closer to home, where do you see yourself in 5 years' time? What will Professor Edgars be doing in 5 years' time?
You will find me right in the middle of this same conversation and this same action, that I am not a leader driven by position, neither am I a leader driven by what is popular, neither am I driven by a leadership which has got the greatest number of people on its side. I am driven by the impact of society, the positive as it may be. I am driven by the delivery of the basics. I would love to talk about all issues that are happening in the world, but for me, there are basics that we must speak to towards Africa. And while that is said, I equally feel the need to take into account the various apologia for the businesses that have articulated by otherwise thoughtful historians that in the next 5 years, a dream in itself could be just a dream. But I argue that if we are to start in developing Africa, we must tidy history. And in Professor Ferguson's memorable words, that will be a jolly good thing with a capital J, capital G, and a capital T. I will reasonably summarize that Africa will always find a space, and I want to be as important to Africa as Africa is important to me.
I'm extremely optimistic about the future of Africa, having young Africans such as yourself in the driving seat, pushing the continent forward. So that's great to hear.
Quote of the week.
As people, we often have quotes, mantras, proverbs, or affirmations that keep us going when times are challenging or even when times are good. Do you have one you can share with us today?
Wow, Adamu, you ask the toughest question. Do I have one? Do I have 50 of them?
Give me a top 2 or 3.
I think my best of all times would be nothing succeeds like success. You can try and sanitize that conversation 100 times, but nothing succeeds like success for me. And the other is, it would be a shame to die without making a major contribution to humankind. We are our own greatest critics, but be that as it may, Africa needs solutions, and those solutions will only come by a few people stepping up and saying, we want to be part of the answering of what Africa is. And we are humbled by the opportunity to be in the middle of it all. Africa, at one point, they could say that leadership and politics was the lifeblood and at once the mother's milk of human affairs, and that cannot be denied. But right now, there's a new age leadership that is taking over, and that new age leadership must then speak towards accountability, ethical leadership, and transcend the conversations that have happened for the last 40 to 50 years of different historical patterns.
As we are coming to the close of the conversation, it's been an extremely informative, insightful conversation. I've actually taken away so much information and knowledge from today. So thank you for that, Professor Edgars. But before we go, do you have any closing remarks, final calls to action for people who are interested in the work that you do, or just interested in general in terms of social entrepreneurship, social development in Africa?
I think the bigger part of the dialogue that we must seek to solve is not entirely just the idea of social entrepreneurship, social development, is the idea of social citizenship. And if the recommendations of social citizenship are that we are developing a viable social economy, then my parting shot would be that we must seek to create a modicum of economic welfare and security to the right to share to the full social heritage and to live the life of a civilized being according to standards prevailing in society. We must respond to the clarion call of our forefathers of Pan-Africanism in saying that Africa in itself is important. And for us to play a part in that, then we must start to seek the promise and reality in creating a shared identity towards creating and realizing social citizenship. If we can do that, Africa will no longer just be an appellation. We are worth conquering in terms of sitting on a table and saying to the rest of the world that Africa has answers of its own. Africa has got its own critical skills. Africa has got its own people. We cannot lose young people to bigger economies while ours fail. We must be the ones to come back and say, though we have learned from the greatest, we will implore all of the Africans to start putting solutions into our Africa. We are all united. We are brothers and sisters in everywhere. And for those who would like to read more of my work, they can find it in so many different platforms. But more than ever, it has been only a pleasure and an honor in being in this particular podcast. And great stuff you're doing, Adamu. This is what we need to do. We need to be detailed to the decimal in the conversations we're having today. Thank you.
Amen. Amen. What a way to close today's conversation. What an amazing conversation that was. As I say, knowledge on knowledge on knowledge upon even more knowledge. So thank you for taking the time out of your busy schedule to have this conversation today, Professor Edgars.
Thank you so much.
More blessings and success in the future to you. And
thank you.
Look forward to keeping in contact and collaborating in the future.
Thank you, Adamu. I look forward to that. And we must always remember where we are all African all the time.
100%. Thank you. And we will speak soon.
Yes, look forward to that, Adamu. Have a good one.
Thank you to everyone who has listened and stayed tuned to the podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, share, or tell a friend about it. You can also rate, review us in Apple Podcasts or wherever you download your podcast. Thank you and see you next week for the Unlocking Africa podcast.